Hello, and welcome back to The Complete Pilgrim. Today, I want to talk about some of Southern Europe's historic Jewish neighborhoods. There have been Jewish districts in cities throughout Southern Europe going back as far as the Roman era. In early centuries, these were just neighborhoods where many Jews lived. But during the Middle Ages, such neighborhoods became increasingly segregated from the general populations. Such segregation ranged from simple dedicated streets to which Jews were confined after dark, up to full-on walled and gated areas which Jews could not leave without permission. The idea of Jewish ghettos as we think of today emerged in the 16th century in the city of Venice, Italy. Such neighborhoods proliferated throughout Europe until the Napoleonic Wars, when many countries ended segregation against Jews. By the end of the 19th century, most of the old ghetto walls had been torn down throughout the continent. Today, some of Europe's oldest Jewish districts can be found in countries such as Italy and Spain. Here are some of Southern Europe's most fascinating and historic Jewish neighborhoods. The Venice Ghetto was the first of the Jewish ghettos that later appeared in many cities throughout Europe. Because of Venice's need for economic and mercantile expertise, as well as for its need for go-betweens with the wealthy Islamic lands of the East, Jews were generally tolerated and even welcomed here. Nevertheless, the lack of available land, as well as the Christian population's discomfort at having so many wealthy Jews nearby, led to the establishment of a segregated Jewish district. This was the first true ghetto of the post-Middle Ages and is still an active center of Jewish life in Venice. The Jewish community of Venice was one of the most unique in Europe. While never a significant religious center of Judaism, Venice's geographic location and mercantile interests made it a major center of Jewish economic life in the Middle Ages. Because the practical Venetians tended to put economic interests ahead of religious ones, Jews were largely free to come and go, and many settled here. As the Inquisition began to take root in the West in the early 16th century, many Jews fleeing Spain and Portugal relocated to Venice. They were allowed to stay, but to appease the church, they were forced to reside in an area known as the Campo Ghetto, or Iron Foundry District. This later became the Ghetto District, or simply the Ghetto. The Venice Ghetto became something of an architectural wonder. The district was densely populated, so the Jews built upwards, creating a rare-for-the-time high-rise district. Over time, as the importance of the Venetian Republic waned, so too did the city's Jewish community. Unlike many other places where they were forced out, the Jewish population of Venice merely faded over the years. Despite its age and relatively small Jewish population, the Venice Ghetto remains surprisingly intact. It is comprised of two areas, the Ghetto Vecchio, or Old Ghetto, and the Ghetto Nuovissimo, or New Ghetto, which is surrounded by canals and accessible by bridge. The gates which once guarded the entrance to the ghetto were destroyed during the occupation of Venice by Napoleon Bonaparte. Most of the ghetto sites, including several synagogues, are clustered around the district's historic center. The history of the ghetto is documented at the Jewish Museum of Venice. The Jewish community of Rome, centered in the city's ancient Trastevere district, is one of Europe's oldest. The current Jewish neighborhood stands on the former site of part of the wall which once enclosed the city's ghetto. This quarter of the city has been home to Jews since the 1st century BCE. A number of Jewish families, some of which can trace their lineages back many generations, still live in this neighborhood. The first Jews to settle in Rome most likely arrived during the Hasmonean period in the 2nd century BCE. The community survived during the revolts of their brethren in Judea, the legalization of Christianity, and the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. Because of their proximity to the seat of the papacy, the Jews of Rome were alternately protected or persecuted depending on which pope was in power. Despite the arrival of the Renaissance in Italy, the persecution of the Jews of Rome increased significantly starting in the 16th century. The city's Jewish ghetto was formally established in 1555 and was not abolished until 1870. The Ghetto of Rome was among the last major medieval Jewish ghettos in Europe to be dismantled. After the walls came down, much of the neighborhood was cleared and rebuilt. The ghetto was reinstated for several years in 1943 and 1944, during which time the Jews of Italy suffered great losses to their community at the hands of the Nazis. Despite this, the neighborhood survived and has continued to be home to a vibrant Jewish community ever since. While the Ghetto of Rome is now gone, there are still remnants to be found. The Jewish Bridge, so named because it led from the central city to the Jewish quarter, has been in use since Roman times. A number of buildings, mostly shops, date from the Ghetto period. Several nearby churches have inscriptions in Hebrew urging the local Jews to convert. The Great Synagogue of Rome houses a history museum with exhibits covering more than 2,000 years of Jewish life in the city. The Jewish communities on Malta date back to the Roman era. Several of the island cities, notably Valletta and Rabat, were home to Jewish districts that trace their roots back to the 1st century BCE. The Jews of Malta survived the collapse of the Roman Empire, as well as numerous wars and conquests, and were still around in the late Middle Ages. Unfortunately, Malta eventually came under Spanish rule, and the Jews were forced out at the end of the 15th century. Some managed to stay on the island, likely practicing their faith in secret. More relocated here after the island became a British territory in the 19th century, and several thousand Jewish refugees found sanctuary here during World War II. The community now is relatively small, with most Jews having emigrated from here after the founding of the modern State of Israel. Evidence of ancient Jewish neighborhoods can be found in both Valletta and Rabat. Perhaps the most popular surviving landmark is the Jewish Sally Port in Valletta. One of the few such structures still in existence, all Jews entering and exiting the city of Valletta were required to use this gate. In the early years of Christianity, Malta's Christian and Jewish populations appear to have lived as one community. The Catacombs of St. Paul, located in Rabat, are named for the Christian missionary Paul. Both Jewish and Christian burial sites can be found in these catacombs. Some of the oldest Jewish artwork to be found outside of the Holy Land is here in these catacombs, such as this engraving of a menorah. It is unknown exactly when Jews first settled in Toledo, but it might have been as early as the Roman era, or possibly during the years of Visigothic rule that followed. There was at least a small community of Jews here by the time that Spain was conquered by the Muslims in the 8th century. During the years of Islamic rule, the Jewish community of Toledo thrived, with a population that supported at least 10 synagogues. In 1085, a Christian army from the Kingdom of Castile conquered Toledo. While the Muslim population of the city suffered, the Jewish community was mostly left alone, at least for a few centuries. As Spain became increasingly united under Christian rulers, anti-Jewish sentiment increased, coming to a head in the late 15th century. Toledo became ground zero for the infamous Spanish Inquisition, and over the course of 6 years, many Jews were tormented and killed in the city's Plaza de Zocodover. By the 1500s, all of the city's Jews were either converted, imprisoned, exiled, or killed. Despite this, several important landmarks of the Old Jewish Quarter have survived. This includes several synagogues, which were confiscated by the crown and repurposed as churches. Among these are the Ibn Shusin Synagogue, one of the oldest essentially intact synagogues in Western Europe, and the El Transito Synagogue, which is now home to the city's Sephardic Museum. The Plaza de Zocodover, although not part of the Old Jewish District, is still an integral part of Toledo's Jewish heritage. A memorial plaque commemorates the victims of the Inquisition's auto de fe, when many Jews were tortured and met horrible fates in this square. Cordoba was one of the greatest centers of Judaism in Western Europe in the early Middle Ages. From the time that the Muslim Caliphate here reached its height in the 10th century until the late Reconquista, the Jews of Cordoba flourished. Under the Caliphate, the Jewish community here grew and thrived, with many Jews serving in prominent positions under various governments. The great Jewish intellectual Moses Maimonides was born in Cordoba in 1138 CE. In 1236, 5 centuries of Muslim rule in Cordoba came to an end when the Christian forces of the Reconquista captured the city. Muslims were persecuted and their grand mosque converted to a church. The city's Jewish community was left alone, albeit in a lesser position than they had enjoyed under the Muslims. In the late 15th century, the Jews of Cordoba came under increasing persecution by the country's Christian rulers. As in Toledo, the Spanish Inquisition led to the end of the community. Today, Cordoba's Jewish quarter largely looks like it has for centuries. The Cordoba Synagogue, the only surviving Jewish house of worship in the city, is built on the site of an earlier synagogue. This magnificent Moorish building underwent a major restoration in the 1980s and was rededicated on the 850th anniversary of the birth of Moses Maimonides. The plaza outside is now called Tiberias Square in honor of the city in Israel. A statue of Maimonides was erected here in the 1930s in honor of the city's favorite Jewish son. The Seville Jewish Quarter, also known as the Santa Cruz District, is one of the most beautiful former Jewish neighborhoods in Europe. The entire area is a labyrinth of narrow, whitewashed alleys leading to secluded plazas filled with fountains and orange trees. Jews lived here for many centuries, first under the Muslims and later under the Christians. By the early 13th century, the Jewish community of Seville was the second largest in Spain, after Toledo. In 1248, Christian forces of the Reconquista captured Seville. The Jews of the city were relocated into their own quarter and separated from the Christian population by a wall. Despite this, the community enjoyed a brief renaissance. Unfortunately, many of the Jews here were killed during a pogrom in 1391. As elsewhere in Spain, the Jews were driven out of the city in 1492. The Jewish quarter of Seville is a walker's delight. There is little left of Jewish interest per se, but there are a few things for intrepid explorers to hunt down. Some of the original streets of the quarter have been preserved as they were in the 14th and 15th centuries, and the church of Santa Maria la Blanca was the city's former great synagogue. One favorite site of the quarter is a house with a picture of a skull painted on the front. This was once the home of a Jewish woman who fell in love with a Christian man. In true Romeo and Juliet fashion, their story did not end well. Also in the quarter is a small museum with exhibits on the history of the Jews of the city. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it and would like more information on Jewish tourism, please check out my book, The Complete Jewish Pilgrim, a guide to 200 of the world's most sacred, historic, tragic, and triumphant places of Jewish interest, available on Amazon. Please find the link in the description. For more information on religious travel and pilgrimage, please visit my website at thecompletepilgrim.com. I also have several travel books available on Amazon: The Complete American Pilgrim, The Complete American Military Pilgrim, The Complete Jewish Pilgrim, and the award-winning The Complete Christian Pilgrim. These links can be found in the description.